Tonight on The Computer History Museum presents Revolutionaries.
So if we can basically have a world where every child is educated and every person, every citizen has economic opportunity, they end up taking charge of their own destiny.
John Wood and Matt Flannery have succeeded both in computing and in social change. Is it possible to do well and to do good? We explored that question in this enlightening conversation with KQED's Dave Iverson. Major funding for Revolutionaries is provided by the Intel Corporation.
Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be back at the Computer History Museum, and especially to talk about this topic with such distinguished guests. So let me give you a bit more information about each of them. Matt Flannery, sitting right next to me, is one of those ridiculously young social entrepreneurs who has already made an enormous difference. He was a 20-something computer programmer at TiVo when he began developing the idea for what would become Kiva. Kiva provides a means for people to connect to other people through lending. So for as little as $25, people can provide loans that might assist a baker in Bangladesh, a farmer in Kenya, or an aspiring restaurateur in Vietnam. Matt left TiVo to make Kiva a reality in 2005, and now just 7 years after that, Kiva has provided over $300 million in loans, benefiting nearly 800,000 small businessmen and women, mostly women, I might add. And the repayment for those loans is 98%. So please welcome Matt Flannery. John Wood is a former Microsoft executive whose life was transformed by a trek across Nepal in the late 1990s. More about that trek in a moment. But that experience prompted John to begin a passionate pursuit to help kids in the developing world, particularly girls, get an education. He left his position as Director of Business Development for Greater China in Microsoft and founded Room to Read in 1999. 13 years later, Room to Read has built 13,000 libraries in the developing world. To put that in context, by the way, Andrew Carnegie built 2,500. Room to Read has also built 1,600 schools, and its programs collectively benefit 7 million children. He's the author of Leaving Microsoft to Change the World. John Wood. So I'd like to begin by asking you both about this turning points in each of your careers. And since I mentioned that trek across Nepal, John Wood, why don't you start us off with by talking about what happened as you were wandering around in Nepal?
Well, I was fortunate enough that one day I woke up and decided I just wanted to escape from Microsoft for 2 or 3 weeks and get away from email, the dreaded Monday morning management team meeting I had come to really dislike. And just get out. And so I went out to the Annapurna circuit in Nepal. It's an 18-day, 180-mile trek around these beautiful 27,000-foot mountains. It's a very beautiful part of the world, but also a very poor part of the world, one of the 30 poorest countries in the world. And I was very fortunate. On day 2 of my trek, I met a headmaster by the side of the trail. I was drinking tea. He started talking to me and invited me to come see his school. And I thought this is a chance to see the real Nepal, not the tourist Nepal, so I eagerly accepted his offer. Walked for 2 hours up some very steep mountain passes, just dirt trails, and got to the school, and it was just completely dilapidated. Dirt floors, sheet metal roof that leaked, turning the dirt floor into mud. They had no desks for the kids. They had 80 children crammed into a room that probably should have held about 20 or 25. And then the headmaster said, you know, come see the library. And I got excited. I don't know about the rest of you. I was a library geek as a kid. It's not cool to say it, but I loved libraries as a kid. So I thought, okay, the library will be the happy part of the tour. So we went to the library, and it was completely devoid of books. I said to the headmaster, where do you keep the books hidden? I don't see any books. And he said, well, the books are so precious, there are so few, we must keep them locked up so the children cannot harm them. So fans of irony note that we're locking the children's books up. And when he finally got the key to the padlock and showed me the kids' books they had probably 15 or 20 books that were backpacker cast-offs. They were things that thoughtful trekkers had left behind. But we're talking here about, you know, Danielle Steele romance novels, not something that a kid should read. And so I asked the headmaster, I said, respectfully, you have 450 students. Why do you have no books in your library? And the headmaster said, well, in Nepal, we are too poor to afford education. but until we have education, we are always going to be poor. And that, to me, struck me because any one of us probably have a grandparent or a great-grandparent who grew up in poverty and probably would never have escaped were it not for education. So those simple words led me to say, I will help you as much as I can. I'll help you open the first library, and went back a year later with 3,000 books on the backs of 6 rented donkeys. And it was the biggest day in the history of the village. And I looked at this and said, this feels great, seeing these kids with books, but this is a tip of the iceberg. There are so many people in the world who don't have books or libraries, and they're not going to stay poor because they're dumb or lazy. They're going to stay poor because the world's not reached them at a young age and given these kids an opportunity to get education. So I went back to Microsoft. Within 2 months, I worked up the courage to finally take a deep breath, walk into my boss's office, quit, and I declared, I will be the Andrew Carnegie of the 21st century and the Andrew Carnegie of the developing world.
And was there for you, John, was it those words that individual said to you that was a kind of tipping point? Were you sort of partway there and you needed that nudge?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out what came next after Microsoft. I pretty much figured it would be something else in technology, probably for a smaller company. As I joined Microsoft and it was 5,000 people and it was getting to the point of being, I don't know, 35,000, 40,000 at that point. So I knew I wanted to do something else, but I thought it would be something else in tech that I'd make a lot more money in. And I never thought I'd do the abrupt U-turn of actually quitting, living off my savings, working for free. But really for me, a lot of it had to do with my father, because probably like many people here in the audience or people listening on the radio, we all have a grandparent or even a parent who was born in poverty. And almost every one of us has a story of somebody from our ancestry being the first to finish high school, the first to go to university, the first to hold a white-collar job. And my father always said to me, hey, I'm one of 7 kids in my family, the only one to go to university. The only reason I went to university was because of a scholarship. So my parents always said to me, you got lucky. You were born in the middle class in America, right place, right time. So thinking that there's kids in the developing world who are born in the wrong place at the wrong time, that to me was enough to make me say, forget about making more money and making rich people richer. Forget about making myself richer. I'm going to try to help a lot of kids in the developing world get access to education so they can change their lives, just as for all of us here on this stage, our lives have been changed through a world-class education.
And Matt, for you, you're at your computer, you're working at TiVo. What happened?
Well, it wasn't that abrupt. I would say that I grew up sort of in a house that was focused on international development. My mom was a volunteer for World Vision. My older sister worked for World Vision. I was always sponsoring children, half a world away when I was growing up, but I was also really interested in technology and started programming computers at a relatively young age. I found myself graduated from Stanford in 2001, and the economy wasn't so good, but eventually got a job programming for TiVo. I wasn't an exec. I think someone said I was an exec, but I was probably the lowest level programmer at TiVo at the time. And I really didn't know how I'd sort of make my life work. I felt like there was something missing. My passion for international development as a child wasn't being fully fulfilled. And then I went and saw, a speaker, Professor Muhammad Yunus, who started the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. Probably a lot of you guys know who he is. He's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And he really inspired me. He said something about how capitalism doesn't necessarily capture our full dimensions of our personality. So it incentivizes our selfish side, our side that wants to accumulate resources, but not necessarily that side that wants to reach out and be unselfish. So that essentially set me on this journey, which eventually led to starting Kiva. I took some time off from my job, and I volunteered at a microfinance institution in Uganda. And what I saw there really shocked me. I thought I'd be shocked by stories of poverty, oppression, disease, starvation, and such. But instead, it was a really, really uplifting experience. It was actually quite joyful. Myself, kind of an entrepreneurial person, I found myself trading entrepreneurial stories with entrepreneurs, men and women in that part of the world, and felt a real commonality and a hope. And I just felt like if everyone could experience that commonality, and we could break down some of the stereotypes which hold sort of Africa and the US apart. And so I began to craft the web experience, which led to Kiva. It's essentially sort of a more mature sponsor-child dynamic, whereas you're sponsoring a business, you're partnering with someone in business, you're seeing that person as an agent of change, a vessel of hope. And it was an organic experience. So for 2 years, I just did that at night in cafes and such.
And was it for each of you, were the skills you had, whether that's as a computer programmer at TiVo or a Microsoft development leader, were they transferable? Could you take what you were learning? You mentioned the sort of common denominator that you felt, Matt, between you and those people. Were there common skills that you learned as a computer programmer that then you could aim into this new career?
Definitely. Well, at Stanford, I studied human-computer interaction and design. And so I also, at TiVo, got exposed to a company with a great brand and an inspiring mission and a great name. And so I took all that learning about, that Silicon Valley ethic around design and providing a simple user experience to the public and applied it to something that I was really, really passionate about, which was international development. So super transferable. I'm so thankful for those years of working in high tech.
And for you, John, let me ask it the other way around. What wasn't transferable? What did you not learn at Microsoft that you had to learn when you started Room to Read?
Fundraising. I mean,
you mean that wasn't an issue at Microsoft?
Well, I mean, I think that the challenge with the easiest way in the world to become a philanthropist is to make $1 billion, start a foundation, hang out your shingle, say I'm a philanthropist, and on Monday morning there'll be 50 people at your door asking you for money. The hardest way to become a change agent is by starting an NGO from scratch with no endowment, without having enough money yourself to fund it. And in my case, leaving Microsoft, I had no fundraising experience because for the most part, the capital markets are relatively efficient for for-profit businesses. When you actually look at philanthropy and charity, the markets are blatantly inefficient. So I had to start speaking a completely different language of trying to figure out how do you pitch foundations, how do you pitch individuals. I mean, at Microsoft, if we wanted to start a new unit, we just went and asked for whatever we needed, and Bill or Steve would probably beat the person down asking for it to a lower number, but the capital was there. You could hire people. I think for the nonprofit sector, one of the biggest challenges for me was actually just figuring out how to get the funding, because we had literally after 1 year, hundreds of villages that were asking us to help them build schools, help them build libraries. So I basically had to learn very quickly how to become a fundraiser, which basically means, get your butt in an airplane and speak as much in public as you can, and never, ever, ever be afraid to make the ask.
I want to ask you about how you make the ask, but before I do, well, maybe this actually is the same question, which is, I suspect that part of making the ask is telling a good story about what Room to Read is. So tell us a good story about what Room to Read best represents.
Well, I think for me, I'll tell you a story from Vietnam when I was there on a trip in the summer of 2008. And I love working in Vietnam because obviously the United States did a lot of damage in that part of the world. I mean, a lot of different countries, including France, have done damage there. But there's just such hope and optimism in Vietnam now. There's such a desire to join the rest of the world and to engage with the rest of the world. And there's a real Confucian respect for education. And one of my favorite moments was being at the opening of a library. And the joyful part, the ribbon cutting happens and there's speeches and all that stuff. But then you actually watch the kids stream into the library. And I was walking around the library just looking at, hundreds of kids, and they're just so excited. They have books, they're brightly colored children's books they've never seen before. Their eyes are wide open. And this boy walks up to me. He's probably like 11 years old, and he shakes my hand and he says, "Mr. John Wood, I want to welcome you to our library, and I want to thank you for helping us to have this beautiful new library." And he was so articulate. And I said, well, are you using the library? He said, "Yes." He said, "Last night, before the library opened," he said, I climbed in through the window. And he said, I brought my flashlight. He said, "Mr. John, I read 9 books last night." And I love that story because we tend to get into these segmentations of us versus them or Africa versus whatever. People are the same everywhere. We're all born with the same gray matter. Kids love to read. Kids love to devour books. And that 9 books last night story to me is why I do what I do. And the fact that we're going to open 2,000 libraries this year alone, and over 1 million additional kids will have access to them, that's what fuels me.
Tell me a favorite great story.
I'll tell a recent story since we're on the topic of education with John here tonight. Kiva's recently gotten into education loans. One thing I've witnessed over the past 6 years, I've gotten to travel a lot, meet a lot of people, and the first thing microfinance borrowers usually want to spend their money on, in addition to food and medicine, is education. And all over the world, mothers are struggling to pay school fees for their kids. Going to school is a privilege. It's not forced upon them. It's not a requisite. So it's an extraordinarily privilege for students and for mothers to be able to send their kids to school. In every country I visit, it's quite universal. we recently got into the business of education loans at Kiva. So about 6 years in, after doing 6 years of business loans, we got into education loans, and we're funding secondary school education in Kenya right now. There's a school called Strathmore University that Kiva's partnering with. They receive hundreds, if not thousands, of applications from students all over Kenya every year, and they have to turn down most of them. But every year, there's about 200 kids that get in that can't pay to go to the school. And they give one scholarship a year to these 200 kids. So every year out of 200, one of them gets to go to school. Education's about 15,000. All across the world, what I've noticed outside of the US and Europe is that there's no student loan programs. So student loan programs exist here, but they really, really don't exist in places like Kenya. And the government certainly isn't giving student loans. So one thing we're interested in, we're just experimenting with it this year, is becoming a student loan provider, sort of filling that role that governments place in the developed world, but filling that in the developing world. So Strathmore, it's sort of like the Harvard of Kenya, agreed to partner with us to do this, to give loans to 20 kids out of this 200 kid pool this year. And so we traditionally started with $75 loans to farmers, and now we're doing $15,000 loans for students to go to school.
It strikes me as a bit of a risky venture.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in the concept of risk for both of you, because I don't tend to think of charities, generally speaking, not always, as rolling the dice a lot. Do you think that that's something that you both brought to your ventures that makes them different in some ways than the usual sort of philanthropic effort? John?
Yeah, well, I think we have to take risks because we see all around us problems that just seem to get worse or that don't get solved. And so obviously what we're doing doesn't always work. So I think that funders need to recognize that organizations like Kiva and Room to Read need to have some risk capital. We can go do some stuff that's different. So I'll give you an example of this. When we started out at Room to Read doing libraries, one of the big mistakes we made was it was mostly English language books that we put into the libraries because that's what we could actually get donated to us. And we worked in places like Vietnam and Nepal and Cambodia where English was taught as a second language. But we went out and did a survey of the students to ask them what would cause you to use the library more. Longer hours, open at night, open on weekends, what do you want? And 52% of the students we surveyed in Vietnam and Nepal said they wanted more books in the mother tongue, which sounds like a giant, kind of duh. Of course kids want books in their mother tongue because that's the language they speak at home. But the for-profit publishers don't publish children's books because there's no market in a place like Laos, where the parents are poor, or Nepal, or Bangladesh. There's very little market for children's books, but that's obviously where illiteracy starts. So there's this whole supply chain of poverty that starts with the fact that kids don't have books in their mother tongue. Well, we looked at that and said, well, we have to not just be the Carnegie of the developing world, now we have to become the Dr. Seuss of the developing world by finding local authors and local artists who can produce original content so kids will have books they can relate to. Now, thankfully, here in Silicon Valley, there's a great organization, the Skoll Foundation, that takes risks. They've funded both Kiva and Room to Read. They gave us a small amount of seed funding to become a publisher of books in the Nepalese language. And that started with 10 books in the year 2004, and again, using local authors and local artists, because we don't want to take books and just translate them, because then a kid in Zambia is reading a book about the White Christmas and doesn't understand the concept of caroling or eggnog or fireplaces. But we have local authors and local artists, and from that first seed grant from Skoll for our first 5 books in Nepal, we've now produced over 700 original books using local authors and local artists in over 20 languages, ranging from Zulu to Xhosa to Bangala to Sinhalese to Tamil. We'll have over 1,000 original titles by the end of next year. And that's all because Skoll dared to put $50,000 in the beginning to say, guys, you're social entrepreneurs, take a risk, don't be afraid to fail. And we need more of that.
And how do you make that case, Matt, when you're talking to whether it's foundation support or others, or the would-be lender to say, I'm going to contribute $25 and that might help so-and-so start their, plant their crops. But it's a different argument to say, I'm going to help loan $15,000 to someone to go to school.
Right. Well, in Silicon Valley, we don't have a well-established philanthropic tradition. And so what I like to do is try to appeal to the venture capital mindset that we're also familiar with. If you look at VCs, they typically say, you know, 2 of our 10 investments should hit a home run. And we're okay with, you know, 4 to maybe even 8 of them failing, as long as 2 of the 10 succeed. And I think philanthropy should be more like that. We should tend to think of it as the R&D capital of society, or the startup capital for non-commercial, non-proven entities. So if we can just convince philanthropists that, hey, taking a risk is good, even in the charitable space, and we should have some tolerance for failure. A lot of the leaders of nonprofits don't feel they have the freedom to fail, which is tough.
I interviewed Jim Fruchterman of Benetech the other day, and he, at his St. Mary's college commencement address, his advice to the young graduates was fail early, fail fast, fail often. Do you think that...
I'll bet the parents in the audience loved hearing that.
Yeah, that's just what I invested $200,000 for. But is there truth to that? And do you think that is that a critique you would make of philanthropic organizations generally, that they're too afraid to fail?
Well, I don't think they feel the freedom to fail because our donors, and if you see a charity fail for some reason, there's a big scandal, we're so critical of it, we hold them to such a high bar. They're either really, really good or really, really terrible, and the in-between is almost non-existent.
John?
I think Matt said it well.
Let's turn the question around and talk some about Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley has a reputation for not being philanthropic enough. Would you agree?
Well, I don't know if you can generalize. I would say that probably there's some really generous philanthropists in Silicon Valley. There probably are not enough of them. What I would say, you know, to repeat the line from this program for tonight, right? Andrew Carnegie said, "He who dies rich dies disgraced." And there are so many people in this world, not just in Silicon Valley, but everywhere, who have so much money, and what's the point? You're going to die, right? Newsflash, we're all going to die. So what happens? You give the money to the government, which probably is going to squander quite a bit of it away. You're going to leave it to your children or grandchildren, who probably already have a lot of money, and I mean, too much money can spoil a kid at a young age. Or you can invest it in his lifetime, and you go to like the Benjamin Franklin idea that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Let's start investing more in prevention. Let's get out and give kids clean water, give kids immunizations, give somebody a microloan, give kids education, because that is the ounce of prevention. I think for me, my criticism of Silicon Valley in general is that it's the world capital of innovation in technology. It is clearly not the world capital in innovation for social entrepreneurship, for actually getting out and having a huge, huge, huge impact on the world. And I think there needs to be a lot more capital that goes into the stuff that's non-traditional.
Have you both been transformed by the personal connections that you've made? You talked about when you first went to Uganda, I think, Matt, and you to Nepal and elsewhere. Is it in the end personal?
Oh, for me, it's really personal. I started off Kiva. I was in a kind of a point of crisis in my life, a bit of a quarter-life crisis, questioning my identity and everything I was going to do, and I was quite jaded about the people around me and the state of humanity in general. So the process of starting Kiva was just this big awakening, this uplifting experience, and it's just continued because what I get, I have probably the best job in the world. I get to meet wonderful people and the best sides of these wonderful people in all parts of the globe, whether that be in San Francisco or London or places of wealth, but also in places of extraordinary poverty, and to see the commonalities among those two people, those two sides of the coin, and to see how actually we're just separated by circumstance. And if we can just connect, there's so much good that can happen. If people just understand each other, so many wonderful things happen.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's funny, as Matt and I both think we have the best job in the world. Both of us think that. And so, you know, the whole point of doing well by doing good, I think we both have done well for ourselves because we're just really happy people because we get to do what we're passionate about. And there's so much of the world where people just completely lack passion, right? If you want to see that, you know, drive to the airport and get on American Airlines. So those people are not passionate. And I'm really passionate about what I do because I was transformed by education. And I, you know, last night was nearly in tears. At midnight, I'm staying in a friend's apartment in San Francisco to save on not paying for a hotel. It's midnight. I'm logging on to email. And I get this email from a girl in Cambodia named Huawei. She was put through secondary school in Room to Read's program. She then managed to find a benefactor who is underwriting her university. She's now in her first year in university, and here's this girl in Cambodia, and my little thing pings that I have a new, when that little ghost box comes up that says you have a new email, and I see it's from Huawei, and it's reporting to me that in her first semester in university, she received 1 A- and 1 A in her first 2 courses. And I wrote back to congratulate her, and then she wrote back to me immediately and said, John, I will not let you down. I will not let the Room to Read donors down. I'm going to be successful. And I sat there in tears thinking, A, here's a girl in Cambodia that the world probably didn't think would ever finish 7th grade, let alone secondary school, let alone university. But B, I thought back to my first trip to Cambodia in 1994, seeing the wreckage and the destruction that Khmer Rouge had wrought on the country of Cambodia, killing 1.3 million people. And I thought, this is the antidote to everything. No matter what's happened in the past, if we give people education, and as Matt and Kiva are doing, economic opportunity, they won't need aid 20 years from now. They will be self-sufficient.
I was in Haiti recently, where I'd done some reporting after the earthquake and then went back to help as a volunteer on a project. And I met, this project is involved in feeding hungry kids in Port-au-Prince, and they also want to build a school. And I met a boy who wasn't in school, 8 years old. And through a translator, so found out why he wasn't in school. And it's because, oddly enough, in Haiti, most schools are private. Government doesn't have enough money, so most schools are private. They don't cost much. It costs $250 a year. But for Bildot, this young boy's mom, she could afford to send 2 of her 3 kids to school, but just 2 out of 3. And so Bildot was standing there with no school to go to. You realize in those moments, I think, how just a little bit can make a tremendous difference. What advice would each of you have for someone who hears your stories, sees what you've done, and thinks, maybe I could do something innovative and make a difference? Where would you say to start?
Start today. So that's common, but really, I didn't believe Kiva would work when I started it. I wasn't confident. I didn't have a good plan. Everyone told me it was illegal or it wouldn't scale, and I believed them. So instead of taking it seriously, I did it as a side project for 2 years. And through that experience, I got convinced by others that there was something here, something would work. But I certainly didn't know that. And if you could replay myself 7 years ago, looking at myself now and hearing myself talk to myself, it would be a trip, because I didn't believe it. And so the thing that made it work for me was I just kind of figured out what to do today. And each step was extraordinarily small. It wasn't fast at all. And I had a lot of time to do that. And through the process of doing that, I really learned a lot. And I felt more confident each day in that process.
John?
I think my advice would be threefold, and I'll echo what Matt says. It's just get started as quickly as possible. Don't engage too much in navel gazing, because there's a lot of good that needs to be done for the world, and you might as well get started sooner rather than later. Secondly, I think a lot of people, make the assumption they have to start something from scratch. And there's quite often, I think, a lot of organizations out there where the car is already in 2nd gear or 3rd gear or 4th gear, and if you kind of get involved with that organization, you can help that car move even faster. So Room to Read, for example, has fundraising chapters now in 57 cities around the world that collectively raise over $12 million a year for us, right? People haven't quit their day jobs. They simply have added something to their portfolio called Room to Read, and the Kansas City chapter might fund 1 school a year, the Hong Kong chapter might fund 50 schools a year. But there's a lot of organizations out there that need the expertise that's in this room or from our radio audience. So don't assume you have to start something from scratch. And then so my third piece of advice, especially here in Silicon Valley, is don't assume the solution has to involve high technology. Right? One of the biggest frustrations I have is that people sometimes think that if it's low tech, it must not be very good. If it's high tech, it must be great. And if you actually get out to the coal face, in the poorest parts of the world, there's no electricity, and there's no Wi-Fi grid, and there's almost, so little. There's not even schools. There's not even clean water wells. Most of what's being done is very, very low tech, right? The resources might be gathered in very high-tech ways, like Kiva does or that Room to Read does, and we might keep all our records in the cloud in Salesforce.com. We might be using Skype and WebEx and other technologies to keep our organizations completely bound together on a global basis. But if you actually get out to the developing world and look at the way that wells are being drilled, or vaccines are being delivered, or kids are learning to read, there's almost all of it is really very simple. And you know, Tim Kugel, the founding CEO of Yahoo, who's the board co-chair with me at Room to Read, always says in our meetings, the KISS rule, keep it simple, stupid. Don't get too, you know, committed that it has to be high tech to go solve the problem. That should never be the way we look at it. It shouldn't be, is it high tech or is it not high tech? It should be, does this provide a real solution to a real problem to a real person? And if the answer is yes, be agnostic about how much technology is involved.
Well, that takes us to some of your questions, so let's get to that. And this person writes, how can we contribute to your causes other than dollars? Are you looking for volunteers? If so, how do we sign up? I mentioned Jim Fruchterman at Benetech, who does this project called Social Coding for Good, where he tries to match up people who have particular skills with particular needs. What about that? How could people, if they have a particular skill, whether that's language recognition or whatever, be helpful to each of you?
Yeah, one of the critiques of Kiva when I started and I didn't believe it would work was it's not scalable because it's labor intensive. And I said, yes, you're right, I don't have the answer. A few years later, I found the answer, and that was through volunteer management and leveraging the cloud, so to speak, in the crowds. So what we've been able to do is create several pools of volunteers that basically make Kiva work. We wouldn't work without it. So if you're at home and you know a foreign language, we have 400 translators translating the loans from French to English, Spanish to English, Wolof to English, crazy stuff like that. Just logging in remotely and translating the loans. And if that loan doesn't get translated, it doesn't get funded. So people feel a super intense sense of satisfaction doing that. If you're lucky enough to have time to travel, we send about 100 volunteers to the field to go work in places like Cambodia or Nicaragua or even Pakistan. Every year. So there's 100 Kiva Fellows, and if you want to apply for that program, you can find it on our website. And also coders. So I'm a coder. I love coding, still code once in a while, and we have an API. And people are coding using our API every day, writing apps, Facebook apps, iPhone apps, web apps, all sorts of stuff. So yeah, if you want to learn about that, you can email me, matt@kiva.org, and I'll send you to the right place.
Talk about transparency. Your
yeah,
email
we're on the radio, folks.
John Wood, what would you be thrilled with if someone walked up to you right now and said, you know, John, I can do...
It's some of the things that Matt said, along with, I mean, people with PR skills, we're always looking for help in that area to connect ourselves with media so we can get the story out. So much of celebrity sometimes is about philanthropy, or sorry, so much of philanthropy sometimes is about celebrity. I think what the media need to do more of is actually cover the solution that actually works rather than worrying about how famous the person is who's behind it. We always have use for editors because we produce, you know, this year we'll build about 170 schools across the developing world, and every one of our donors who funds a school gets a report that's written by our local team. That team might have Nepali or Lao as their first language, so the report in English needs to be edited. There's lots of stuff people can do, and you know, in keeping with Matt, you know, Matt@kiva.org, I'm John at roomtoread.org. Yeah. Like, the number one thing when you run a charity is don't be hard to find, right? I mean, I can't imagine, you know, that most executives are going to be like, oh yeah, if you want to email me, I'm, you know, jack@ge.com, and I'll be on your, so nothing against jack@ge.com. But I think charity leaders have to be really accessible and available. But I also would say just, I'll plant the seed here, that anybody in this audience tonight could go into work tomorrow morning, announce to their coworkers, I'm going to raise $35,000 and build a school through Room to Read. Or I'm going to raise $5,000 and set up a library through Room to Read that serves 400 children. And they will be overwhelmed with how quickly people say, I'm going to get behind that campaign. That sounds great. Maybe we can even go visit the school and meet the kids who use it. So I would say don't ever overlook the fact that no money equals no mission. And organizations like ours do need people to volunteer to be fundraisers. And we have a campaign called Friends Asking Friends. It's all automated on our website. People can go to it and they can pick a country, pick a project, say I'm going to raise $5,000 to fund a library in Bangladesh or $35,000 to fund a school in Nepal. And they're inundated with people at their business or their family who want to help because we all know that without education, we're not where we are today in life.
But you both actually have focused your energies in many ways. Most of your loans, right? 80% of the loans, is that right, Matt, go to women? And John, it's been a particular passion of yours to educate girls. So just take that as a jumping off point about the relationship between the importance, I guess, of educating young women, and if you have any thoughts on family size connected to that.
Yeah, I do. I mean, when there was this whole thing that was in the media about the 7th billion person being born and how we're moving towards 9 billion or 10 billion, what I thought was the overlooked part of the story is that so much of that relates to lack of education. If you look at the amount of education a woman in the developing world receives, and that's where the population growth is happening, right? It's not happening in Finland or, the United States population growth happens mostly because of immigration. But if you look at actually, kind of net growth from the population in the developed world, it's really not happening. Families are having 1.9 to 2.1 kids. The population explosion is happening in places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, where women and girls do not get educated. So if you actually think out 50 years, the best thing we could do to help the world is to educate girls and women. And I really want to be very clear, we can't overlook boys, right? As a former boy myself, I would never want to actually overlook boys. We have to make sure the boys go to school, but in the developing world, 2/3 of those who are out of school and 2/3 of those who are illiterate are girls and women. And that just to me is a shame. Probably like many of the people in the audience listening on the radio, I have an educated mother who read to me, an older sister who read to me, and a grandmother who read to me. Without those 3 powerful women, I'm not who I am today. So if you educate girls in the developing world, you have so many benefits from better family health, better family income. Every year a woman's educated, her eventual wages increase by 9%. You have lower infant mortality, lower maternal mortality. An educated woman is twice as likely to vaccinate her children. The list goes on and on and on. And when you go back to it and say $250 per girl per year solves this problem, why aren't we making this one of the biggest issues of our time?
And similarly, in terms of giving women opportunities in business.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, we fund about 80% of the borrowers just turned out to be women on the website. That's because, first of all, they pay back at higher rates in communities. They often stay closer to home and they focus on the family, and so they're there when loan officers come to collect the loans. But also, if you ask them, universally, the thing you'll find is that they want to start a business so that they can keep their kids at home or send them to school and not lose them to things like, big city jobs or sex trafficking or slavery. It's an issue, in almost every poor country around the world. And empowering the mothers of those young children is the way to do it.
Do you think in a way that what you do is fill in with the same skills of the market, business and markets, but where markets don't work?
Exactly. So
yes.
That's why I said the word R&D capital for society. Philanthropy can be viewed as the R&D capital for society, whereas we're funding interventions that are pre-commercial. We're targeting populations that are pre-commercial. So it's not that profitable to lend to rural villagers in Kenya from San Francisco and transferring the money there and back. It's not a very profitable enterprise. But we're sort of laying a foundation and proving that, hey, there is some commercial activity here. And in the course of the next 10, 20 years, hopefully that will become a more mature market for financial services.
Yeah, and at Room to Read, we always argue that business should care because there are 1 billion people in the world today who live on less than $1 a day. There are 2 billion people who live on less than $2 a day. And so for 2 billion people in the world today, almost every product or service offered by the capitalists of the world is completely irrelevant because they have no money.
Yeah.
Right, you can talk about selling, 1 rupee packets of shampoo, but that's not really, at the end of the day, all that lucrative of a business. So we try to say, if Room to Read does its job right, and if Kiva does it's job right, you're going to end up living in a world that is a lot more prosperous, and that's great because we know today problems cross borders like never before. It's the most open the world's ever been. That's good because you can sell to the world. It's also bad because terrorism crosses borders, pandemics cross borders. So if we can basically have a world where every child is educated and every person, every citizen has economic opportunity, they end up taking charge of their own destiny. And I think that if we want to look at the world we leave to our children and grandchildren, we want it to be a peaceful, prosperous, and stable world. So I think we have to reach out to the hardest places to work, even if it's extremely difficult to get there.
This person wants to know, the repayment rate for your loans is so high. It's because it's sexy, right?
Not exactly. It's very unsexy, actually, but it's very dependable. So, you know, as the world was crashing with the financial crisis in the last few years, the repayment rate on Kiva actually beat the Dow Industrial Average. And lending to the poor across the world is a very, very conservative financial thing to do. We're dealing with informal markets where people don't have many options, and they're taking loans from in a community, and you're able to pick the best bets in that community. And people pay that back at extraordinarily high rates. And it's also, a good thing about it is it's separated from the global financial system. So therefore, if Goldman Sachs crashes, Lehman Brothers crashes, they don't really feel it in rural Zambia.
Have you encountered opposition from governments? I'm interested in this with you, John, because in some ways, what you're doing, at least in some countries, I would think would be threatening sometimes to the powers that be.
So you're referring to the fact that North Korea has not invited us in yet? No, we pick and choose our countries very, very carefully as we look at where we're going to launch next. And one of the key variables we look at is, will the government be supportive? Because we partner with the Ministry of Education. We're not building a parallel system. We're building schools and libraries that will be mainlined into the government system. And will the communities be supportive? Because we don't go in and build the school for the community. The community comes out and donates labor and sweat equity to each project. So if there's resistance, we will simply walk away, right? You can't push a piece of string uphill. We can't want it more than the local community wants it. But we actually find, Dave, we have the exact opposite problem. We have thousands of villages and country after country after country saying, we want what Room to Read has. We want that library. We want that literacy instruction for our teachers. We want the addition to be built to our school. We want education for our young women. And what pains me is the number of times we have to say no. Because no is a very ugly word, right? We try to say not yet. Let's hope we can come back in a year and get this done. But I'm very conscious of the fact that every day we lose is a day we don't get back. And the whole notion that any child can be told at age 5 or 6, you were born in the wrong place at the wrong time to the wrong parents, and you did not get educated, we believe that notion belongs on the scrap heap of human history. So we have to keep fighting to get to as many places as possible. The good news is there's the opposite of resistance. There's open arms from communities saying, we do indeed want to work with you, and we will provide the sweat equity to make this happen.
Matt, here's a question about in the early days, Kiva had a surplus of funds, and there was an issue with reloaning people who didn't understand the model. Were you able to overcome that misunderstanding? And there was also the question of sort of how you had to be very careful about how you phrased what you did, because people had to understand that this was money that was going to institutions, not necessarily from me to, you know, so-and-so the farmer in Kenya. How did you deal with that challenge and overcome it?
Yeah, just a little bit of the history of that. It's a long story, hard to say in this time frame, but the way I started Kiva was working with a few rural pastors in East Africa, and I opened bank accounts with them, and I would just transfer the money from my personal checking account in San Francisco to their bank account. The pastor would withdraw the money, then give it to villagers or church members, collect the loans over a period of time, and wire the money back. After doing that for a couple years, we got on Oprah, we got all this publicity, and we could no longer just keep expanding pastor by pastor across the world. It was no longer scalable, and it was not a way to grow fast. So we started working with nonprofits and small banks all across the world who essentially were already doing lending in their community. And so what they would do was post up a loan on the site, and then the Kiva funding would come at the end of the month, and then they would give out the loan to that person. The money started coming so fast that all the loans started selling out, and they started to predict this and see this, and so that what they would do was give out the loan and post it on the site in the same day, then wait 30 days to get the money from Kiva. And so the connection, the financial tie, was a little bit severed on the upfront. Now on the repayment, you are still connected to that borrower, because if that borrower doesn't repay at Kiva, you don't get the money back. So you're connected financially to that person. So it's kind of a complicated story, but what happened in 2009 was some of the bloggers started seeing this, and we made it very clear on the website about that. But it was they were saying Kiva was really a little bit fake, meaning the person on the end of the transaction wasn't really waiting for the money. And so my money isn't necessarily going to that person. Now, if you think of that question, it's kind of a philosophical issue. I mean, in all cases, we're wiring money internationally. It's not your dollar. There's Kenyan shillings, and so we're converting the currency. And you know, that was a really, really great event for us because we had to sort of overhaul our website, be very, very clear exactly, you know, how it works. We're working with institutions. We send them the money. They use that money to fund the loans. We're not sending the money directly to the people because those people are unbankable. They don't have bank accounts to begin with. That's why we're working with them. Now, in the last year, we've actually reverted back to the old model, and we have this thing where we're actually sending money to people on their mobile phones. Because for the first time in history, actual rural poor people in places like Kenya actually have a bank account. It's called their cell phone. And so we're able to text money from San Francisco directly to the cell phone of a villager, a rural farmer, for instance, in Kenya. And that person won't get the money if we don't text them that money, because there is no intermediary institution. When we started that, we had no idea if these people would pay back. We're almost a year into that pilot, and we have a 99% repayment rate by texting money from San Francisco to rural people in Kenya. So it seems to be working, fingers crossed. Yeah.
Do you think that crowdfunding will help make it easier for entrepreneurs to do well by doing good?
Absolutely. I think
describe what crowdfunding means.
Crowdfunding is a vague term. I think it refers to the general movement around the world of people spending small amounts in crowds, usually online, to fund projects. So Kiva's one of the founders of the crowdfunding movement, but there's a lot of great orgs like Donors Choose, Global Giving. More recently, Kickstarter is really, really exciting. And so more and more people are using the small amounts in their wallets to sort of do the job that banks used to do. And people are different than banks. People have a greater risk tolerance. They're more motivated by impact. They want to see the impact. They want to hear back about it. And so that's a great opportunity to go places and fund projects that banks would never fund.
It occurs to me, listening to both of you, that we talked some earlier about you can't be afraid to fail. The other common denominator, and I would wonder if you would think that this is key to being able to accomplish what you're both accomplishing, is don't be afraid to ask. I mean, you're asking all the time. Before this started, you were tweeting, and I mean, you got to be out there, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the challenges in the nonprofit sector is that fundraising is treated as this dirty little side business that we have to somehow be, I don't know what, afraid of or ashamed of or whatever, and it's the elephant in the room, right? And I'm never at all shy about asking the customer for the order, because I'm not asking for myself, I'm asking for $250 so that a little girl in post-Khmer Rouge Cambodia can go to school, or so that a child who might have had their school destroyed during a monsoon in Bangladesh can get their school rebuilt. And so I am unabashedly unapologetic, and I'm unabashedly enthusiastic about fundraising because it gives every one of us a chance to do something for a kid that the world probably has written off. And what we're trying to say to that child is, we're not going to write you off. We're going to be there for you so that you can develop that wonderful gray matter in your head and get educated from a young age.
For John, do your libraries include computer access to Google? I don't know why they'd pick Google. Or just...
No, only Bing.
Or actually, where this question was going was, or just printed materials.
Yeah, so we currently are very low tech at Room to Read. We're unapologetic about being low tech. I've got a book here, Zach the Yak with books in his back, from Nepal. And one of the beautiful things about our local language books is we can print them for less than $1 a book. And the great thing about books is they work in places that don't have electricity. They work in places that are off the grid. Books don't have operating systems that potentially break down. Books don't need to be rebooted. Books don't need to be upgraded. And when the cost of a library is literally about $12 per child served, it is the least expensive solution with the highest effectiveness. So then, this is again one of the things I try to throw out to Silicon Valley is, let's not assume that if it's low tech, it must somehow be bad. Sometimes the best solutions are the low tech solutions. Now, I will say quickly that by the year 2020, we expect there will be about 25,000 room to read libraries in the world. So as the price of technology and e-readers and like that comes down, we hope to be a very, very active consumer of it, but we're not going to do that until the cost per child served of the high-tech solution is cheaper than the cost of the low-tech solution, and right now the cost of the low-tech solution is orders of magnitude cheaper. So by staying low-tech, we reach more kids more quickly for less money.
Here's a last question from our audience, and then I'll have one to wrap things up. This person wants to know, how should I go about leaving my high-tech job and work for you guys?
Well, that's really easy. roomtoread.org actually posts all of our open positions on our website. We're constantly hiring because we keep growing very, very quickly. And we are very, very open to hiring lots of corporate refugees, as we call them.
Yeah.
Matt?
The same. So we're growing fast too. We hire product managers and computer programmers and technologists all the time. So you can check out our jobs page on our website. You can email me as well, and we can talk about that.
I'd like to close by just asking you each to give your best elevator pitch to everyone in the room, not to support Kiva or Room to Read, but to figure out a way to make a difference.
Well, I think giving has proven to be one of the most thrilling things you could ever do. And so it's actually quite easy and quite fun. So once you start doing it, I think you'll find it's kind of contagious and kind of addictive. And so I would just say, just find some simple way to start today, and it'll be easy to continue.
So I would start with the assumption people are probably already doing a lot of good for the world. So I guess my thing would be to say, keep doing it, do more of it, do it with passion, because passion's contagious, do it with a smile on your face. And as much as you can do it, talk about the solution rather than talking about the problem, because the world's really in need of solutions. And I think this is, you know, the center of the universe here in Silicon Valley for innovation in so many ways. I think there's an A+ grade there. I would like to see Silicon Valley someday also be known as the center of social innovation around the entire world, here at home and across the developing world and everywhere else. And I think with great wealth comes great responsibility. And there's a heck of a lot more we can all collectively do together over the next couple of decades. The world's never been more open, the world's never been more connected, and we can use that to do good for the world, or we can use that to, you know, download more videos. I mean, let's use it to go out and do good for the world.
John Wood and Matt Flannery, thank you for doing the good that you do.
Matt Flannery and John Wood, two high-tech entrepreneurs who did well and are using their social ventures to do good. These are the stories we tell at the Computer History Museum. Join us next time for another episode of Revolutionaries.